Following on from our prior video on how to model revenue, in this video we're going to turn our attention to operating expenses and the different ways that you can model operating expenses. So let's get started. With wages, which is usually for most businesses one of their bigger expenses, there's a couple of ways to model it. The first one is the simplest, and I call it the OK method, and that is just to project wages as a percent of revenue. So similar to other ways that we've calculated things, here what we do is we put the actuals here. So the historicals for 2020, 2021, and 2022 are here, hard-coded in blue, and any calculations are in a black font. And so what we did here is we took wages for the previous 3 periods and we calculated what they were as a percentage of revenue. So that's as simple as dividing the 800,000 for 2020 by the $1 million of revenue in 2020 as well. So you can see here wages divided by revenue, and that gives you that in this particular year wages were 80% of revenue, and then they went to 78%, and then they went to 76%. So they have been falling as a percentage of revenue. So what we've done here is we've modeled out, hard-coded the percentages of revenue that we expect it to be. So we've kind of held it flat here at 75% of revenue. And the calculation is purely to multiply revenue by that percentage. So revenue of $1.8 million times by 75% gives us that answer of $1.4 million. And you can see how that then calculates. Now, this is an okay method to calculate stuff, but really you start to run into a lot of problems with it, and it's very inaccurate a way to calculate. So one of these next 2 options is definitely better. So here we've done the same thing, the same costs, hard-coded, 800,000, 900,000, a million and 50. But we've also hard-coded the number of employees. So in 2020, we had 8 employees, then it grew to 9 employees, then it grew to 10 employees. And so then we've calculated basically wages divided by the number of employees is the average salary. And so every year the average salary was 100,000, and then it went up to 105,000. So there's 2 things that then you project out for the future period, and actually these should be in blue font because they are hard-coded as well. You basically have to project out, well, how many employees do I need to deliver the increases in revenue that I'm projecting? And what's the average salary for each of those employees? Now that could be raises for existing employees, or some of those additional employees could just be more expensive positions, more senior, or whatever it might be. But you basically punch in how many employees do you expect and what do you think the average salary is per employee. And then that is pretty simple math again. You just do the average salary per employee times the number of employees to get the total wages for that period. And as a check, what I've done here is I've just said, okay, well, we're calculating it different, but what percentage of revenue do those wages then represent? So in this case, it's 78%. So it's gone back up again. So you might say, oh, well, actually, you know what? I'm being too conservative and I'm forecasting too much expense here. And you might want to lower either the number of employees or the average salary to get that percentage back in line. But this is always a good check just to kind of say, okay, this is what we've been spending before as a percentage of revenue. What is it going to be going forward? So that's a better option than the first option that we laid out. The best option in my mind is actually laying out on a per employee basis. So you can see here, employee 1, employee 2, and you can put names next to them or titles next to them. And then for simplicity, I've just shown here the historical positions, so there's 8 positions here for a total of 800,000, assuming everyone gets paid the same. In 2021, you add another position, that's the extra 100,000 there. And in 2022, you add another position and it's 150,000 instead of the 100,000. So to get you to that 1,050,000 of total expense. So in 2023, we add those 3 employees that we were projecting here. In 2024, another 3 employees, and in 2025, another 2 employees. So that gets you to a total of 18 employees that we were projecting if we look at this method up here at 13, 16, and 18. And this method gives you a lot more insight into, it obviously takes a lot longer to build this out, especially if you have a lot of employees. If you have hundreds of employees, that's really going to take a lot of time. Um, but for a company of, 5, 10, 15, 20, even 30 employees, this methodology makes a ton of sense. Just because it gives you a lot more insights into how you're building stuff. Like it might be unrealistic to say in times of inflation that every one of these employees, these original 8 employees, are going to still get $100,000, and you might need to bake different raises in there. Or some of these new positions that are more expensive because maybe they're senior or whatever, maybe that's not enough. Or when you do come to hire them, instead of 150,000, it was 160,000. So, and you can just quickly update that here. So I think the key here is, by breaking it out, you've got a lot more detail. It takes a lot more time, but you could see trends a lot more clearly, and it's going to be a much more effective way to build everything out. And then you can see again, we've done that check of percentage of revenue. So what's the total amount of wages there? And then what is that as a percentage of the revenue? Just to kind of, as again, gut check, are we doing things the right way? So that's wages. Building out something like rent is much more simplistic. You obviously have the number of square foot that you have, what's the assumed price per square foot, and then therefore what your rent is. And so here what I've done is, in the historical period, you basically said, okay, we've got 1,200 square foot and it's $25 per square foot. We've assumed going forward that that's going to remain constant. But given that we're employing a lot more people, we need more square footage. So we're assuming that we've gone from 1,200 up to 2,000 square foot. And basically the math is very simple. It's the number of square foot times the price per square foot, and that gives you, 30,000 per year for the historical periods, and 50,000 per year. And then I like to again just to check that the math kind of makes sense. What percentage that of revenue, which is less relevant, like revenue doesn't drive your real estate expenses or your rent. Really, the thing that would drive your real estate expenses would be the square foot per person. So basically what we've done here is we've just divided that 1,200 square foot by the number of employees that you have up here. And so that gives you 150 square foot. A good rule of thumb is 100 to 200 per square foot. And so you can see how that changes, and that can then drive, okay, we add in enough space? Well, we quickly get down to 110 square foot per head again. So do we need to add more space in the final year? But this is a very simplistic way to model it, but very effective in terms of just modeling out rent, which is probably in most businesses' case the second largest expense, or one of the larger expenses they have. And then we've got a couple of options to model out marketing. So option one would be the simplest. You take the historical numbers here, hard-coded in blue. What does the change year over year? And you just hard code an assumed change, and you multiply the previous year by 1 plus that change. And so this gives you a simplistic assumption for what marketing would be. I think much more relevant for something like marketing is a percentage of revenue. Revenue, more revenue usually requires more marketing spend in most businesses. And so just looking at what percentage of revenue that spend is kind of important. So here, historically, it's been 2 to 3%. And going forward, we've assumed 3%. And basically, you just multiply revenue by 3% to get the projected expense for marketing. Okay, great. Now we can turn our attention to the other line items in the expenses. And I haven't modeled them all out here because they follow a very similar trend. Like I think, something like travel is another expense that most businesses have. I think percentage of revenue is really very relevant in this case. So using, again, like we did on the marketing expense, calculating out what it was historically and then assuming a percentage going forward is probably the best way to do things. Office expenses is probably the same. Um, it's not going to be a major line item for most businesses. And percentage of revenue is usually the best way to calculate it. And then other. Now, other businesses might have other line items, or your business might have a line item that is not reflected here. A lot of time, either percentage of revenue is a good driver. If it's more tied to headcount, it could be $1 per head that you calculate. But there's multiple ways to kind of project things. But what I normally try to think about is, what is the correlation of that expense? Is it correlated highly to revenue? Is it correlated to something like headcount? And from there, use that as a driver going forward. Anyway, I hope this was helpful in terms of just how to model out some of the operating expenses for your business. If you have any comments or questions, please do leave them below. And if you have any requests for future videos, definitely let me know in the comments below. See you next time.